December 17th, 1944. The forest of Ardennes was heavy with snow and war. The trees had no leaves because of winter, and you could hear big guns firing far away. Somewhere near Bastogne, a Sherman tank was hiding behind a small hill. Its metal body was shaking from the freezing cold. Inside, 4 men were sweating under thick wool clothes, and they were very afraid. Their breath turned into fog. The big gun on the tank had already fired more than 24 times that morning. The loader's arms hurt. The gunner's nerves were worn out from pulling the trigger so many times. But the real problem wasn't the freezing wind or even the German tanks circling around them. It was the quietness because they were almost out of bullets. The machine gun on top was empty. The machine gun built into the tank only had a few bullets left, and the normal ammunition belts made of fabric and metal had gotten stuck twice already in the frost. No new supplies were coming, no radio was working, no hope. The tank commander stared at the ice-covered road where smoke was rising from American trucks that had been destroyed hours earlier. His lips were cracked as he said quietly, "This is it." Then the loader, 22-year-old Calvin Briggs from rural Kentucky, reached into a burlap bag under his seat. He pulled out a roll of something strange. It wasn't given to him by the army. It looked handmade. Strips of cotton cloth sewn together by rough hands. Loops stitched carefully with even spaces between them. Inside each loop, 50 caliber bullets were packed tight like corn in a harvest bin. The gunner looked over and made fun of it. "That thing again?" Calvin didn't answer. He just fed it into the gun's receiver. He had sewn it by candlelight over many weeks. They laughed when he first showed it. They called it hillbilly engineering, but today, in the middle of a war that destroyed men and machines, it was the only belt left. And when he hit the trigger, the Sherman roared. Not for 10 seconds, not for 10 minutes, but for 4 straight hours. Before the snow, before the shells, before the war turned boys into men and machines into lifelines, there was Calvin Briggs. He was born in the spring of 1922 in Lyon County, Kentucky. His family owned a small farm just west of the Cumberland River. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. Calvin's hands had rough skin by age 10, not from war, but from tightening bolts on his father's rusty tractor and fixing old plow straps they couldn't afford to replace. He was the kind of boy who could fix a fence with barbed wire and a belt buckle, who could clean a deer, grease a gearbox, and weld a broken axle before most kids learned their multiplication tables. By the time he was 17, he had already built a working engine out of junkyard parts, duct tape, and hope. But Calvin was more than just a farm worker with dirty boots. He had a curious mind. He read Popular Mechanics magazine like it was the Bible. He once walked 6 miles to a county fair just to see a diesel generator working. When war broke out in 1939, he followed the news stories like a man watches the sky for storms. Quiet, focused, always thinking. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Calvin signed up to join the army the next day, not because he was angry. Not even because he loved his country, at least not in the way posters and parades demand. He joined because he believed in doing things right. Because war, as he saw it, was like the biggest machine ever, terrible, loud, and unforgiving. And maybe, just maybe, if someone like him who understood how things worked was there to keep the parts moving, a few more boys might live to see their farms again. Calvin was trained as a tank mechanic, but he didn't stay in the back for long. He volunteered to work as a loader in the field, saying that the best way to understand what broke down was to be there when it broke. His officers thought he was strange but reliable, quiet but not shy and always fixing things. In North Africa, he made a water boiler from old artillery shells. In Sicily, he fixed a broken track using bands from wine barrels. And during the long push through France when supply lines got thin and every nut and bolt mattered, Calvin Briggs became something of a legend. Not because he talked big, but because he fixed big problems. But his boldest invention didn't come from any battlefield. It came from boredom. Late in 1944, as winter began to bite and the German attack hadn't started yet, Calvin noticed a pattern. The standard fabric ammunition belts used to feed the Sherman's Browning machine guns kept getting stuck in the cold. The metal links bent. The cloth got stiff. Even small amounts of water caused the belts to jam. So he started sewing. At first it looked silly. Cotton strips from spare uniforms, canvas pieces taken from seat covers, even string and shoelaces. He stitched loops by hand, spacing them with the help of a bullet casing and a ruler he carved out of wood. He worked at night, hunched over a lantern, cursing when the needle slipped. His crewmates laughed and called it Calvin's country quilt. The gunner told him, "You think Hitler's going to give up when he sees your arts and crafts project?" Calvin didn't argue. He never did. Instead, he kept making it better and testing it. One day, he loaded it into the backup gun during practice. It fed smoother than the regular Army equipment. No jam, no snag, just clean, steady firing. Still, no one took it seriously. The supply officer refused to write it down in his records. His lieutenant rolled his eyes. "It's not Army approved," he said. "Save it for the county fair back home." So Calvin folded the homemade belt, placed it in a burlap bag, and tucked it under his seat just in case. He never imagined it would be the one thing standing between life and death. But war has a way of turning silly things into important things, and in the frozen woods of Ardennes, that bag of stitched cotton was about to become the most important invention on the battlefield. By December of 1944, the Allies believed the war in Europe was almost over. They had stormed the beaches at Normandy in June. They had freed Paris in August. The German army was retreating on almost every front. Supplies were stretched thin, yes, but spirits were high. Many soldiers thought they'd be home by Christmas. They were wrong. On December 16, 1944, in the dark forests of Ardennes, Hitler launched a last desperate attack. Over 200,000 German troops supported by 1,000 tanks and huge artillery guns smashed into the thinly spread American lines. It was bold. It was desperate. And it caught the Allies completely by surprise. What followed was chaos. Trucks loaded with winter gear never made it. Fuel trucks were attacked. Ammunition storage areas were bombed. Radios went dead. Tanks got stuck by the dozen and froze in place. Literal steel coffins in the snow. For frontline crews like Calvin's, the problems grew fast. In the cold, nothing worked the way it should. Engine oil got thick like mud. Batteries died without warning. Grease hardened around moving parts. Even the simplest things, like feeding a belt of bullets into a machine gun, became a struggle. The standard Army ammunition belts for the Sherman's machine guns were fabric-based with metal links, spaced for 50 caliber rounds. In desert heat or dry weather, they worked fine. But in Ardennes, where temperatures dropped below zero and everything was soaked in freezing fog, the belts got stiff. Water crept into the fabric. Ice formed in the loops. The length spent slightly in the cold, just enough to cause misfires or total jams. Soldiers tried to fix the problem. Some heated the belts near the engine block before loading. Others rubbed them down with oil or wrapped them in scarves. But the moment you fed them into the gun and started firing, the friction mixed with cold and dirt turned them into useless, twisted messes. Gun jams weren't just annoying, they were deadly. In tank fighting, seconds mattered. If your machine gun inside the tank or on top of it stopped working during an attack, enemy soldiers could overrun you. If your loader couldn't keep up with feeding the system, your main gun would fall silent in the middle of a firefight. And that's exactly what was happening across Ardennes. Entire armored units found themselves with not enough equipment, not enough supplies, and under constant attack from German tank divisions who knew the area and did well in cold weather. American supply lines were stretched too far and got tangled across icy back roads where trucks crashed and fuel froze in the lines. One tank crew wrote in a letter weeks later, "We weren't fighting Germans. We were fighting the weather, the roads, and the fact that nothing we had worked like it should." This was the situation Calvin Briggs faced when he climbed into his Sherman that morning. No replacement belts were coming. The supply unit assigned to his group had been attacked the night before. Rumor had it only 2 of the 8 trucks made it through. The others were burning somewhere near Malmedy. His tank, call-signed Lion Charlie 4, had less than 200 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Half of it was in belts that had already jammed once before. The rest was loose, not connected, and unusable without proper equipment. Still, they rolled out because they had to, because no one else was left to hold the line in that area. And as the sky turned gray and the snow got heavier, Calvin could feel it in his gut. The war wasn't about strategy anymore. It wasn't about generals or politics. It had become something brutally simple. Who could keep their machines running long enough to survive? And tucked beneath his seat, folded neatly in that burlap bag, was the thing everyone had mocked, the thing no one had written down or approved or even looked at twice. A homemade ammunition belt sewn by a farm boy with numb fingers and too much time on his hands. And in a matter of hours, that silly invention would become the reason 4 men walked out of the forest alive. In the world of war, there is little room for unusual things. Everyone doing things the same way means survival. Following the rules is gospel. And anyone who dares to do things differently, no matter how good their intentions, is often met with more making fun of than support. Calvin Briggs learned that early. He had shown his prototype belt to his tank crew during a break between patrols near the French border. They were parked in a muddy orchard, drinking bitter coffee from metal cups. The sky was a dull smear of gray. Calvin, proud but quiet, held up the cloth band like a magician showing his final trick. It didn't look like much. Worn cotton loops carefully spaced, every inch handmade. The stitching was rough but solid, strengthened with doubled thread. Calvin had even rubbed the fabric with wax and grease to keep it flexible in the cold. The driver chuckled first. "What's that? A scarf for bullets?" The gunner leaned forward, holding his cup of coffee like a priest with communion wine. "Briggs, what in God's name is this? You sewing for the Red Cross now?" Even the tank commander, Lieutenant Jarvis, a stern man from Ohio with a regulation buzz cut, raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you get the idea?" Calvin explained. "The jamming, the frost, the stuck belts." He talked about how the fabric absorbed water and got stiff in the cold. He told them about the hours he spent sewing, measuring spacing by hand, testing loops with practice rounds. He was calm and exact, like a mechanic describing a broken engine. But the response wasn't interest, it was laughter. The commander shook his head. "It's not Army-issued, kid." "And there's a reason for that," the gunner added. "Yeah, it's because nobody wants to fire a machine gun with their grandma's oven mitt." Even when Calvin managed to show them how the rounds slid into the loops without resistance, how the belt coiled neatly without kinking, how it fed better than metal link chains, they didn't care. They weren't mean, just tired and doubtful. After months of battle, most men stuck to what they knew, what was familiar, even if it didn't work. That night, alone by the side of the tank, Calvin wiped down the belt with a rag and folded it gently into the burlap bag. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He never tried to prove himself again, but he didn't stop either. While others drank or played cards, he tested different types of cloth, tried different oil mixtures, adjusted the stitching to resist tearing. At one point, he even cut up an old duffel bag for sturdier loops. He became something of a quiet curiosity, the ammunition belt guy, the running joke. If someone's gun jammed, they'd tease. Should have used one of Calvin's quilts. If the belts froze, someone might say, maybe we ought to give the boy his sewing kit back. And yet something about it stuck. Because despite the teasing, no one ever threw his design away. They didn't use it, but they didn't toss it. There was a part of them deep down that hoped he might be right. It wasn't just the crew. The supply officer refused to write down his belts as official equipment. "We're not running a clothing store," he said. "Get Army supplies or don't get anything at all." One sergeant joked that if Calvin kept it up, he'd be sewing patches for the enemy. The message was clear. Innovation without permission was disobeying orders. But Calvin never asked for permission. He wasn't trying to rewrite the rules. He just wanted his machine gun to work when it mattered. He knew it wasn't pretty. He knew it wasn't Army approved. But he also knew what happened to tanks that jammed mid-battle. He had seen the burned-out wrecks lining roadsides, the blackened turrets torn open by anti-tank fire. He had helped pull the bodies out. And so while they laughed, he kept sewing, because something in his bones told him the worst wasn't over. And when it came, when the real storm hit, he wasn't going to be the one caught pulling frozen metal from a jammed belt, cursing supply lines that would never come. He would be ready. Even if no one believed him, dawn never truly arrived. On December 17th, the Ardennes sky hung like a lid over the world, heavy with steel-gray clouds that promised more snow. The trees, black and skeletal, leaned over the narrow roads like people at a funeral. And beneath them, American tanks waited. Calvin Briggs sat in the loader's seat, his breath steaming in short, controlled bursts. The inside of the Sherman was a mixture of metal, oil, and sweat, cold enough to sting his fingers, hot enough to fog his goggles once they started moving. The tank's radio had gone silent around 4 a.m. Their last message, hold the crossroad at all costs. Lion Charlie 4, his tank, was one of 6 Shermans scattered across a forest clearing east of Bastogne. They weren't in formation. There was no time. They dug in along a shallow ridgeline, trying to cover a frozen logging trail that now served as a vital supply route. or at least it had been, before German shells destroyed the road. Then at 7:13 the first shell landed. No warning, just a howling shriek and an eruption of snow, mud, and timber 20 yards to their right. The commander's voice cracked through the intercom. "Contact front. Gunner, eyes on." Calvin snapped into action, yanking open the ammunition locker and pulling a 48-pound shell into his lap. His fingers fumbled for grip. Everything was slick with frost. Through the viewing slit, he saw them. Shadows in the trees, camouflaged shapes creeping through snow. German soldiers supported by panzer tanks. The gunner shouted, "Range 600, armor-bearing 295. Calvin jammed the shell into the breech. "Up!" The cannon barked, a boom so loud it punched through the chest, rattling bones. The Sherman rocked back, and somewhere out in the trees, one of the German tanks vanished in a cloud of black and orange. They didn't stop. Another shell screamed in, this time hitting the Sherman next to them, Lion Charlie 2. It didn't explode. It went through. The turret hatch blew open like a kicked door. Flames licked skyward. "No movement from 2, the commander said quietly. "We're on our own." For the next 10 minutes, Calvin reloaded shell after shell. His gloves shredded, his wrists cramped, his shoulder muscles burned. They fired high-explosive rounds, armor-piercing shells, anything they could reach. Then came the sound he dreaded. The gunner slapped the receiver. Machine guns down. The top-mounted .50 caliber had jammed. The fabric belt was frozen stiff, clogged with ice and mud. Calvin yanked it out and tried warming it with his breath, but it coiled like brittle bark. The machine gun inside the tank mounted beside the main cannon still had ammunition, but only 30 rounds remained, and German soldiers were getting closer. "Too close. Briggs, feed it fast," the gunner shouted. Calvin opened the storage bin. Nothing left but loose rounds and 2 belts they'd already tried and thrown away during training. Stiff, swollen. The metal links were bent just enough to jam inside the feed tray. That's when he looked down. The burlap bag still there, still folded. Calvin stared at it, then at the gunner who had already begun shouting, "We're going to lose the gun." "Come on." He didn't explain, didn't ask. He just ripped open the bag, pulled out the homemade belt, and started loading it into the feed tray. The gunner's eyes widened. "You serious?" But Calvin didn't speak. His hands moved on instinct. The belt slid in smooth. No resistance. The waxed cloth held its shape even in the freezing air. The rounds fit snugly in each loop, lined up like teeth in a perfect jaw. The gunner gripped the trigger. The Sherman shook. This time the gun didn't cough or stall, it roared. The machine gun inside the tank opened up in a long, continuous burst, cutting through trees, snow, and bodies. German soldiers dove for cover. Calvin saw 2 of them drop mid-sprint, their rifles spinning from their hands. For the first time all morning, no one inside the tank said a word. The gun just kept firing and firing and firing. Minutes passed. Dozens of rounds spent. The belt fed through the receiver like silk ribbon. Outside, the Germans hesitated. One of their half-tracks tried circling right, only to be met by the Sherman's cannon. Calvin reloaded and they destroyed it in a single shot. Then the tank on their left flank caught fire. Direct hit. Still, they didn't move. Still, the gun kept going. No one could believe it. The homemade belt, mocked, dismissed, forgotten, was working better than anything they had ever used. "Jesus," the gunner said quietly. "This thing feeds like a dream." Calvin didn't smile. He was already pulling the second belt from the bag. They weren't out of the woods. Far from it. But for the first time since the attack began, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting back. The men inside Lion Charlie 4 would later describe that hour as the longest, loudest, and most terrifying stretch of their lives. Shells landed so close they felt the heat inside the turret. Smoke crept through the vents. The walls trembled. Twice they thought the engine had died, but it held. And all the while, the machine gun never stopped. 1 belt, 4 hours, no jams. For the first few minutes, no one talked about it. The homemade ammunition belt kept feeding. The gun kept firing. And the men inside the Sherman just worked like a single machine, each man doing his part, not questioning how or why it worked, just grateful that it did. But as the second hour went on, something changed. The gunner, Staff Sergeant Lewis Hall, leaned back between bursts, panting, his gloves dark with sweat. He looked at Calvin almost bashfully. "You got another one of those things?" Calvin nodded. 2 more in the back pocket of the bag. Hall didn't hesitate. "Load it up. We're not stopping." Up in the commander's hatch, Lieutenant Jarvis yelled into a dead radio, then down at Calvin. "That's your invention?" Calvin paused. "Yes, sir," Jarvis grunted. "Looks like you just saved our lives, Private." No sarcasm, no eye roll, just 5 words. And they hit Calvin harder than any explosion he'd heard that morning. Outside, the snow was red in patches. Steam hissed from the cracked hull of a nearby tank. The forest echoed with distant machine gun fire and the occasional boom of distant artillery. But here in this battered patch of ground, Lion Charlie 4 was still alive, because of a cloth belt no one believed in. By the 3rd hour, the other tanks had noticed. A Sherman to their right called over through signal flags, asking how they were still suppressing enemy fire. Jarvis leaned out and held up the belt like a prize catch. The tank commander across the clearing just stared. 10 minutes later, a runner, a corporal with a bandaged leg, rushed through open ground, ducking fire, holding a note. "Can you spare one belt?" Jarvis looked at Calvin. Calvin didn't hesitate. "Give them the second one. I'll reload the third now." By now, the snow had melted in a wide area around the Sherman's engine. Steam poured from the hatch. Shell casings filled the floor like brass puddles. Calvin's uniform was soaked through. His fingers were numb and blistered, but the belt fed smooth over and over. What began as a desperate gamble had become a quiet revolution. At some point, the joke stopped. No one called it Calvin's quilt anymore. No one laughed about sewing machines or farm boys with too much time on their hands. Instead, they asked how he made it, what material he used. Could he teach them? In that frozen patch of Belgium during one of the bloodiest surprise attacks of the war, a 22-year-old loader from Kentucky rewrote the rules of battlefield supplies. Not with rank, not with orders, but with needle, thread, and pure determination. And by the 4th hour, every man in that tank knew one thing. They weren't just fighting with a machine. They were fighting with an idea stitched together under candlelight. And for once, the Army wasn't laughing. By the 3rd hour of fighting, Lion Charlie 4 was the only Sherman still holding position on the ridge. Smoke curled from the engine vents. The barrel of the main cannon glowed faintly red from repeated fire. Brass casings jammed the floor beneath Calvin's boots, rattling with every turn of the turret. Outside, the snow was shredded, no longer white but churned into gray slush by heat, explosions, and blood. But the gun kept firing. The machine gun inside the tank had now gone through nearly 500 rounds, fed entirely by the 3 homemade belts Calvin had stitched weeks earlier, in silence, in shadows, under flickering light. Each loop measured by hand, spaced with a hand-carved ruler sealed with wax, held its shape. Each round loaded cleanly. Not a single jam, not a single stall, just the steady mechanical rhythm of survival. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. The Germans had tried attacking from the side twice. Both times the gun met them head-on. Shooting burst through tree lines, sending riflemen running. One unit tried to rush with grenades. They were cut down before they crossed the trench line. At one point, a German half-track came toward them from the west, its commander standing upright, yelling orders. Hall didn't hesitate. The machine gun tracked left. Calvin kept feeding. 20 rounds, then 10 more. The half-track turned sharply, its windshield shattered. The gunner slumped. The vehicle swerved off and exploded against a stump. The entire ridge echoed with cheers from nearby foxholes. Inside the tank, Calvin didn't smile. He was already threading the last 6 feet of belt through the receiver. Lieutenant Jarvis leaned down, wiping fog from his goggles. "You sure that thing's not magic?" Calvin shook his head. "No, sir. Just stitched right." Jarvis chuckled. "Remind me to put that in the report." It wasn't just their tank that was changing. Other crews began adapting on the fly. By the 4th hour, 2 nearby tanks, damaged and running low on ammunition, sent their loaders across open ground under cover fire just to get scraps of Calvin's design. One of them took the second homemade belt Calvin had stored in his pack. Another crew, desperately low, tried to copy the structure using cotton from uniform sleeves and cut leather from bags. They worked with sewing needles taken from medic kits and thread from torn sleeping bags because suddenly the Army's problem wasn't lack of courage. It was lack of cloth. And Calvin Briggs, once dismissed as the quiet mechanic with a farm boy hobby, was now the unspoken key to an entire defensive line. Then the artillery stopped. No more shells fell. The German fire slowed down. Their attacks became lighter, shorter, less organized. Smoke drifted through the trees in long, ghostly lines. Bodies littered the snowdrifts. The German attack had hit a wall, and it was built from steel, sweat, and one stitched-together belt of cloth and hope. When the fighting finally died down after 4 hours of constant pressure, Lion Charlie 4 was still upright, scorched, dented, but whole. Inside, the men sat in stunned silence, breathing in steam and smoke blinking through the haze of powder and sweat. The machine gun's barrel was blackened, almost too hot to touch, but the feed tray was still clean, still working. Hall set down the last casing, his voice hoarse. That thing, it never quit. Calvin looked at his hands, burned, raw, the fingertips bloodied where the cloth loops had scraped his skin with each reload. He didn't feel heroic. He felt empty, exhausted, but also, for the first time since stepping onto European soil, understood that what he'd made wasn't just clever, it was needed. In a war powered by mass production, by factory lines and endless crates stamped with serial numbers, Calvin had done the unthinkable. He had built something by hand that worked better than the war machine. And that miracle, that humble hand-stitched belt, had kept death outside their hatch for 4 straight hours. The silence that followed the battle was louder than the gunfire. The Ardennes forest, moments earlier alive with screams, explosions, and the clatter of machine gun fire, now lay still under a bruised sky. Smoke twisted lazily through the treetops. Trees had been split down the middle. Craters steamed with heat. Blood ran black in the snow. Inside Lion Charlie 4, the crew sat motionless. Not because they were hurt, but because they were alive. Lieutenant Jarvis was the first to break the silence. He climbed halfway out of the hatch, looked over the ridge, then dropped back down into the turret. He turned to Calvin. What was that thing made of again? Calvin cleared his throat, voice dry as sandpaper. Cotton strips, wax, some stitching from a seat harness. Jarvis blinked. And it never jammed? No, sir. Not once. The lieutenant reached for his notebook, opened to a blank page, and began writing. Not a punishment, not a warning, an entry, a record. 2 hours later, with wounded soldiers stabilized and the front temporarily calm, a group of officers visited the tank. Among them were supply sergeants, 2 lieutenants from other platoons, and a captain from battalion headquarters. They all came to see the belt. The belt, the same one Calvin had been mocked for. Now it was laid out carefully on the rear armor plating of the Sherman, stretched like a sacred object. It was darkened with powder, stiff in places from heat, but every loop still held its shape. The captain examined it for a full minute before speaking. Where did you learn to do this? Calvin looked down at his gloves. My dad. Farm stuff, fixing gear, sewing feed bags. The captain nodded slowly. Think you could make a few more? I can try. Try fast. By the next morning, Calvin had been pulled from frontline duty temporarily and assigned to a supply tent less than a mile from the ridge. The order came straight from battalion command. His job, reproduce the belt. They gave him cloth, tools, even help. 2 other soldiers who knew their way around a needle and thread. They worked on crates under a canvas tarp, hands shaking from the cold, cutting and stitching while artillery thumped in the distance. By the end of the day, they had 9 belts. By the end of the week, 34. Word spread quickly. Crews across the area began requesting Briggs belts, as they were now unofficially known. Some copied the design exactly. Others tried different versions, adding extra stitching, different loop sizes, oil-based coatings. None were quite as reliable as the original, but they worked. More importantly, they gave crews confidence, because nothing in war is more dangerous than hesitation, and nothing causes hesitation faster than an unreliable weapon. And thanks to a 22-year-old farm kid from Kentucky, there was now one less thing to worry about inside a Sherman. Calvin never gave speeches. He never asked for credit, but every time another loader came by to ask, "How'd you make this feed so smooth?" he'd kneel beside them, lay out the strip of cotton, and explain patiently, exactly, humbly. He didn't teach invention. He taught pride in doing something right, no matter how small. And for the men around him, who'd once laughed, who'd once dismissed him as a hobbyist with too much time on his hands, that quiet skill became something sacred. Because in a war filled with chaos, uncertainty, and machines that broke too often, Calvin Briggs had made something that held, something they could count on. The war ended 5 months later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe Day. Streets flooded with celebration from London to New York. Soldiers wept, kissed strangers, raised toasts. But in a quiet field hospital near Liège, Belgium, Calvin Briggs didn't celebrate. He slept for the first time in days. He'd been working around the clock even after the Battle of the Bulge ended. The Briggs belts had made their way across 3 divisions by March, and though they were never officially adopted into Army supply chains, they were copied, changed, and praised in quiet tones by the men who owed them their lives. Calvin was offered a recommendation for a Bronze Star. He declined. He said the real heroes were the men who never made it home. When he returned to Kentucky later that year, the farm was still standing, but barely. His father had passed away during the war. His younger brother, too young to join the army, had done his best to keep the place running. Calvin picked up where he left off. He fixed tractors. He welded gates. He married a schoolteacher named June and had 2 children. He never bragged, never hung medals on the wall. Most of his neighbors didn't even know he'd served, let alone that he'd helped turn the tide of one of the most terrible battles of the war, with nothing but cloth, grease, and determination. But a few letters trickled in. One from a former tank commander in the 99th Infantry Division. One from a supply officer in Bastogne. One from a crewman who wrote simply, "You don't know me, but your belt worked. And because of that, I got to see my daughter turn 1. Calvin never replied to most of them. He didn't need to. He hadn't made the belt for recognition. He'd made it because something didn't work and he couldn't live with that. Decades passed. He built a garage on the edge of town, taught his son to change brake pads, his daughter to solder wire. He stayed quiet during parades, waved politely at Veterans Day gatherings, listened more than he talked. But once a year on a cold morning in December, he'd go out to the barn, pull down a dusty box, and unroll something faded and frayed. A strip of cotton cloth darkened with age, stitched by hand. His son once asked him, "Did you really shoot the Germans with that?" Calvin smiled. "No," he said, "but I helped someone who did. That was enough." He died in 1989 in his sleep after repairing the same tractor he had first worked on with his father before the war. No monument bears his name. No textbook tells his story. But ask any man who served in Ardennes that winter, and they might remember a tank, a machine gun that didn't stop, and a quiet man who stitched life into a belt when the world was falling apart. War is often remembered in numbers. 16 million Americans served in World War II. Over 400,000 died. Tens of thousands of tanks rolled across Europe. Millions of rounds fired. Billions of dollars spent. But behind every number is a person, a face, a name, a small moment that changed everything. Calvin Briggs didn't win the war. He didn't lead charges or capture enemy generals. He never made the front page of a newspaper. But for 4 hours in the middle of a frozen forest, when everything broke, when the manuals failed and the official gear collapsed under the weight of war, his invention worked. Because it was made not by a factory but by hands that understood machines. Because it was born not from orders but from watching, failing, and quiet determination. Because he cared enough not to wait for someone else to fix the problem. There's a lesson in that. In a world where most people wait to be told what to do, Calvin Briggs stitched a new answer. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he refused to accept that good enough was good enough when lives were on the line. In the chaos of war, we often look for heroes in big actions, but sometimes heroism looks like a young man hunched over a lamp, fingers raw, measuring thread against spent casings, sewing in silence while the world laughs. And when the smoke clears and the silence returns, it's those small acts, the ones no one noticed at the time, that end up making all the difference. That's the mystery of World War II. It was the largest, most industrialized war in human history, won not only by generals, strategies, and production numbers, but also by individuals who saw what was broken and dared to fix it. Even with cloth, even with thread, even with hands that shook in the cold. We don't remember Calvin Briggs because he demanded it. We remember him because when the machine gun wouldn't fire, and the cold made steel useless and death waited in the trees, he gave the Sherman a voice. And for 4 hours that voice roared through the forest, strong and unbroken. What shocked you most? Comment below. Share this story with someone who still believes one person can't make a difference. Thank you for watching.